Welcome to this live stream from those on the world. Tonight we're going to be looking at mythology to mainstream science. The ether. This word has been used for many thousand years and it describes something which is between the material and the non-physical. And I've been looking at this concept for quite a while because it covers a large area. And what I liked about it was the background, this huge history. And then as we get into the 17th century, we get the science. And the science of the ether has actually never been debunked, even though it is implied that it has. Even the general theory of relativity, which was said to have replaced the ether theory, did not actually replace the ether theory, even according to Einstein. And even after we had the general theory of relativity, we still had Henrik Lorentz, who put forward most of the science that we know about ether today. He was still finding and exploring this subject. And interestingly, it's had a resurgence. I was just watching a lady called Chantel Roth, who is now talking about the way that light actually bends in accordance with ether. So we're going to get into that big subject. And it is something that is a little bit offbeat from what we've been covering over the past couple of years, from global governance systems to who we are in the system to the recent ancient history, which I think really does tell us a lot about how we got where we are today. So etheric is another word which everybody seems to have used at one time or another, and it describes a subtle, non-physical energy. It's a concept stated to be used in esoteric philosophies to describe a subtle body that is in contact with the physical body. So hence we get this connection to the outer body experience. In other words, that when the physical body is completely at rest, the etheric body can actually leave the physical body. So this word, I think, describes so much of what we don't know, which is why I think it's such an important subject. So the term also has roots in the historical concept of ether. The etheric body has, of course, its roots in the word ether, the all-pervading medium once thought to fill the universe. Well, not just once thought, it was always thought to fill the universe. Just other theories got in the way. And this is a good point to bring in the present theoretical science, which is basically now descended into computer modeling. And look where computer modeling has got us. Look at the so-called science which has come out of computer modeling. None of it has actually come true as far as the climate goes. And of course, computer modeling has been used by such agencies as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change to push forward a global consensus, which leads to global taxation and further control. So the modeling and the computer simulations and the idea of simulation theory has really got in the way of what was actually very good science. And a friend of mine actually knew somebody who was working at CERN, and he said what they're actually working on, and people working on this idea of string theory don't even know what they're talking about. Well, why would they know what they're talking about? They're talking about abstract concepts, which they say can be observed. Well, the ether is a much older concept, and the word has staying power. It's a useful word for describing the intangible, but the omnipresent and the misunderstood, which is why I think it's quite an important subject to be covering. So it's also known as the fifth element. And I don't really like using the word ancient Greek because there was no such thing, in my opinion, as the ancient Greeks. There was a conglomeration of different people who were known as the ancient Greeks. And of course, the Hellenes were the main people who are associated with the ancient Greeks. But of course, there were many, many more. And Thracians, Illyrians, depends on which part of history we're looking at. And that is really what these shows have been about for such a long time. But Aether in Greek mythology is among the first gods to appear at the beginning of creation. Quite interesting that, isn't it? Because this fifth element has always been there, always reported to have been there. It's even mentioned in the Bible, of course. But yes, it's among the first gods to appear, the god of Aether, the child of Erebus and Nyx. This child, Aether, brought light to the dark universe. And of course, it's associated with light and electricity. So when we're talking about waves of light, we are talking about the ether carrying the waves of light. There's some confusion there, but I think that's a very good analogy, because people start getting confused as to whether the ether is in fact light. Well, what it seems to be is that the ether is a carrier. It's a kind of elasticity which things can move through. And this was the contention that people in the scientific world started to have about the different ether theories. And we're going to get into those tonight. But of course, talking about the mythology is quite important. So ether brought light to the dark universe, making the heavens a pure, bright space separate from the human world, symbolizing the division between earthly and the heavenly realms, the connection between the material and the ethereal world. So ether was pure, bright, and the gods that breathed in the heavens, they breathed what was called air, not AIR, AER, which I think is a different substance. It was the air of the gods. This bright light and air make the heavens a heavenly realm, different from the human world below. So it was quite a sacred idea in mythology and indeed religion. And it's a word that comes up so often. And the Victorians, of course, were still very much into this idea of the ether. A lot of the experimentation took place in the 1800s. The late 1800s is where we had the experiment, which we're going to talk about, which wasn't actually the end of ether, but it was the beginning of the general theory of relativity, which is where quantum physics kind of took over. So there was like this dividing line, which was quite interesting. And what we're finding now is that people are saying, well, what Newton was saying about the ether actually goes along with the general theory of relativity and even the quantum world. So the things that we're talking about, they actually overlap, which is, to me, the most important thing, because what the academic world tries to do is separate them, of course. So yes, we have this book, which I've been looking at. It's a 500-page book written in 1910 or published in 1910, and it's called Theories of Ether and Electricity, written by E.T. Whitaker. The theory of ether in the 17th century is really what it's all about. I'm going to start reading something from this book, which is the preface, which I think is really good. And it brings together the ideas of the time and the science, the alliteration, the way it's been used in history, and the scientific model. So it starts with the observation of the heavens, which has been pursued continually from the earliest ages, revealed to the ancients the regularity of the planetary motions and gave rise to the conception of a universal order. Modern research building on this foundation has shown how intimate is the connection between the different celestial bodies. They are formed of the same kind of matter, they are similar in origin and history, and across the vast spaces which divide them, they hold perpetual intercourse with each other. Until the 17th century, the only influence which was known to be capable of passing from star to star was that of light. Newton added to this the force of gravity, and it is now recognized that the power of communicating across vacuous regions is possessed also by the electric and magnetic attractions. And of course, recently we've had the electric universe theory, plasma theory, which really does make sense. And it certainly goes along with the theory of the ether. Let's carry on. It is thus erroneous to regard the heavenly bodies as isolated in vacant space. Around and in between them is an incessant conveyance and transformation of energy. Now, this is what really interested me about the concept of ether. What is actually in space? Okay, we have the elements which make up atmosphere, we have gases, and we have these trace elements which can be identified. But what holds it all together? What does it all ride on? The ether made absolute sense to me when it was thought of as the background to everything. And a lot of the scientists, actually, that we're going to quote tonight said that. And it's a kind of common sense thing, but it's actually quite a profound thing, which is why I like it. I like this idea that you can bring these bigger concepts, which are philosophical, meaningful, into a scientific paradigm. That word's been misused a lot, hasn't it? Let's carry on anyway. To the vehicle of this activity, the name ether has been given. The ether is the solitary tenant of the universe, save for that infinitesimal fraction of space which is occupied by ordinary matter. Now, of course, we had the idea of dark matter, black holes. All this is conceptual. And the reason that this has been invented, of course, is to explain a system of science. In other words, that they can't explain everything about density, matter, and force. And this is a very important thing because I think the basics of physics are really simple. Even I can understand them. Very, very simple. When we get into the quantum world, it is all about observation and theory. It's all about theory. And that to me is where the thing crosses over. It says, hence arises a problem which has long engaged attention and is not yet completely solved. What relation subsists between the medium which fills the interstellar void and the condensation of matter that are scattered throughout it? Exactly. The word ether is what ties it all together. And now they're talking about the elasticity of ether. This was a concept that was around in the 1700s. I'm going to read more from this book because I hope it's stimulating your imagination and your intellect. This ether pervades the pores of all material bodies and is the cause of their cohesion. Its density varies from one body to another, being greatest in the free interplanetary spaces, of course, because there's more space there. Once it's collapsed into smaller spaces, it's still there, but it acts differently. This is basic science. It is not necessarily a single uniform substance, but just as air contains aqueous vapor, so the ether may contain various ethereal spirits. That's an interesting terminology, isn't it? Adapted to produce the phenomenon of electricity, magnetism, and gravitation, which is, of course, the theory of electricity. Now, this is really interesting because when we think about this theory of an ether and time and space and what they call space time, which is meant to have superseded this idea in certain respects with the theory of general relativity. Well, how do we explain these images of the past, ghosts? How do we explain how we can have these out of body experiences? We've done quite a lot of shows on that. If you're not familiar with it, it's where a vibrational state gets into the body and you leave the body, and then you can observe places and you will find yourself in different places. Robert Monroe did a lot of work on this with Charles T. Tart in the 60s, and this was all under the broad banner of parapsychology, which has now been kind of shut down by the useful idiots of the establishment, basically shooting themselves in the foot. So yes, it's very interesting that say ethereal spirits, because this actually works in so many different ways. In other words, when we're talking about the unseen world, the word ethereal really does seem to captivate and describe what we're talking about, which is one of the reasons I'm doing this. Let's carry on. The vibrations of the ether cannot, for the reasons already mentioned, be supposed in themselves to constitute light. Light is therefore taken to be something of a different kind, propagated from lucid bodies. They that will may suppose it an aggregate of various peripatetic qualities. Others may suppose it multitudes of unimaginably small and swift corpuscles of various sizes, springing from shining bodies at great distances one after the other, but yet again without any sensible interval of time, and continually urged forward by a principle of motion which in the beginning accelerates until the resistance of the ethereal medium equals the force of whatever is moving. Book's kind of disappeared there. Well, it's interesting because this lady who was talking about ether, I was watching this interview, and the interviewers were kind of stopping her, and they were trying to be very, I wouldn't say combative, but they were interrupting the flow of what she was saying by making her explain everything to them. So that really kind of ruined the interview. But what she was saying was really what this book was saying, which was published in 1910, and we're now in 2025. So these concepts are still talked about and still have relevance in the current scientific model. So, has there yet been a satisfactory answer about any of this? We have only theories in this modern theoretical realm of science. We have this idea, black holes, dark matter, constructs to fit real black holes in understanding, in my opinion, because the more I delved into the world of what is now quantum theory, the more it started to look conceptual, and it started to look a little bit like what the climate modelers are doing. Legends in their own lunchtimes, fantasies in their own world. And this was taken apart actually by someone else I was listening to today. I think it's Julian Penrose, and he's very, very academic, very stuck in the academic world. But he was actually saying that a lot of this conceptual science can be done away with in favor of what we can actually perceive and what can be observed in the three-dimensional and fourth-dimensional world. When we get onto string theory, we go to 10 or 26 dimensions. And then, of course, we're getting very close to simulated reality, which is where they want us all to be, the wilderness of the mind, nowhere. So maybe ether is the anchor to the seen and the unseen. So ether, a carrier of information and energy, electricity and light. So it's a carrier. Experiments and proven physics on the theories of light and the transport of electrical current is what we're going to get into when we start looking at these experiments. But let's first get into what it says about ether in the Bible. This is from the Bible in Hebrew. On the second day of Genesis, God created the expanse, or the rachiah. This Hebrew word rachiah is translated as firmament by the authors of the King James Bible. Rachiah is a luminous firmament of interworld linking heaven and earth. The firmament spans the gulf of the heavens, was identified as ether or quintessence, known as the fifth element by the ancient Greeks. According to the medieval alchemists, the firmament has also been termed the supreme luminous sphere. The firmament, which spans the gulf of the heavens, was identified as ether or quintessence, known as the fifth element by the ancient Greeks. According to medieval alchemists, the firmament has also been termed, yes, let's say it again, the supreme luminous sphere. So by supreme, we mean godly, and it is part of creation. Despite claims to the contrary, the concept of ether is alive and well. This is from the AI generated response unit called Google, rebranded as the quantum field, you see. Now, this is interesting, isn't it? Because during the 80s and 90s, as part of the New Age, we had this idea of the quantum field. In other words, they were replacing the idea of ether with the quantum field, or what I would prefer to talk about is the unified field. The unified field is another term which makes absolute sense. In fact, it makes as much sense as the ether, because if the ether is a carrier for what is there, with light and electricity, then so is the unified field. The unified field is what we can experience, I believe, through our own conscious awareness. And I don't think there's anything esoteric about that. I think it's a natural blank state. If we are in a normal blank state and not affected by random thoughts, and the mind can be stilled to the lower frequencies, 0 to 5 or 0 to 16, where about 16 we start to get into slightly higher resonance. But this, it was like 0 to 8 hertz, I think. I did a lot of work on this a few years ago, but I haven't got it in front of me. I'm just going back over a show we did on it all. And I actually studied the outer body experience and how the consciousness leaves the body, and whether, of course, the consciousness leaves the body after death, which is the ultimate question. And from the research that I've done over the years, I'm pretty sure that it does, or it can. But of course, we can never be sure. There are people who say they are sure. I've had experiences which tend to validate that, not just regarding myself, but regarding people who have passed over to the other side. And I know people who've had the most extraordinary experiences there. So this is all to do with the same thing, ether, unified field, because that's another thing we're going to get onto in this show. So yes, the properties of the modern quantum field are equally mysterious, reaching into the realm of consciousness and eternal Pythagorean maths. So when we're talking about the quantum world, we're talking about mathematics, the etheric field and the speed of light, and how light works with refraction, and how light may actually be bending itself. Not actually as Einstein was saying, but in the respect that if it's traveling, then if it's up against another force, then some of the particles will, the waves of light, waves or particles, take your pick, the waves of light will actually start to move faster in the ether than the others. And this is called drag, etheric drag. And that's what they were talking about, I think, in the 1700s. There was a lot of experiments on this. So ether can never go away because it has not been proven not to exist. The term has been desecrated really by being, in modern parlance, gaslit. So in a legal framework, I thought I'd just put this, quite interesting. There is no evidence that ether does not exist, and it is believed that no evidence exists to disprove its existence. There you go. It can't be proven that it doesn't exist. So now we get on to what the academics who want to go against this use to try and discredit the ether theory. Now, this is a bit like what somebody sent me when they were trying to prove that CO2 causes warming, when in fact CO2 is a result of the warming, because the CO2 comes out of the sea after the warming period. So he sent me this paper by Arrhenius, and it does not prove anything at all. I showed it to several scientists who just laughed it out of the room. They said, well, if this is all they've got, they've had it, because this isn't even science. It wasn't done scientifically. It wasn't even done in a controlled way. It was done with a glass box, and they basically had some CO2 in it and said it was heavier than the surrounding air. And that was because of the heat which it produced. And they were saying that this was what was causing global warming. It had nothing to do with it. I'm kind of summarizing it here, but it's not much more complicated than that. So in order to try and disprove the ether theory, Michelson-Morley experiment was officially used to end the theory, it says, in the AI-generated lazy-brained world. It did not disprove the ether. It disproved the idea that ether works in the way that it was expected to work at the time. So in other words, it was all about observation. They expected the ether to respond because they were observing it in a particular way. So the experiment was designed to detect the motion of the Earth through a hypothetical medium called a luminiferous ether, the luminiferous ether, which was thought to carry light waves. There you go. It was a carrier. Using an interferometer, they split a beam of light into two perpendicular paths and then recombined them, expecting to find a difference in light travel, in the time that the light traveled, due to the Earth's motion. Well, I think that's like missing the point, isn't it? Even reading that, it sounds like it's completely the wrong angle. The experiment produced a null result, finding no detectable difference in the speed of light regardless of direction, which contradicted the ether theory and ultimately paved the way for Einstein's theory of relativity. Now, when you see something like that on the internet, be very suspicious, because that's not what happened at all. It didn't pave the way for Einstein's theory of relativity. It was just that people jumped onto that bandwagon. And even Lorentz and Einstein both agreed after this with each other that there was an ether. In fact, I've got some quotes from Einstein that we'll read at the end. So I suppose what we could go on to now is observation. Reality is shaped by the mind. What we perceive as reality is filtered, named, and shaped by our consciousness, our biases, and preconceived notions, as in these experiments. So, in other words, coming to conclusions based on limited understanding and observation. So, okay, let's see what Wikipedia says about this. The result was negative in that Michelson and Morley found no significant difference between the speed of light in the direction of movement through the presumed ether and the speed at right angles. Now, this goes into the refraction theory, I think. I've been reading up on this. But again, it seems to be missing the point. I can't really understand why they think this disproves ether. It doesn't. This was actually copying experiments which were just exploratory, and anomalies were found, of course, because light and refraction was still not fully understood. Even I know that after reading a few hundred pages of this huge tome of 500 pages, The History of Ether. So this result is generally considered to be the first strong evidence against some ether theories. So it's not evidence against ether at all. It's against particular ether theories which these two put forward. So their system did not work in the way that they believed it would. Therefore, it was wrong and didn't exist. That's what really, when we strip it down, happened, as well as initiating a line of research that eventually led to special relativity, which rules out motion against an ether. Well, there's a lot of stuff here that is not actually quite right, but that's the internet. But of course, we have to take notice of what the mainstream are saying. Of this experiment, Albert Einstein wrote, "If the Michelson-Morley experiment had not brought us into serious embarrassment, no one would have regarded the relativity theory as a halfway redemption." In other words, if they hadn't done this experiment and it hadn't got a lot of publicity and it hadn't been used to kind of falsely debunk the ether theory, Einstein's basically saying that I wouldn't have got anywhere with this. Quite interesting again. So to me, it was missing the point. They were using ideas on how light behaves, which was, of course, massive in the 1700s. Newton and gravity were reliable in simple terms. And of course, now we've got the electric universe, and we'll go over that. The electric universe theory proposes that electromagnetism, not gravity, is the primary force shaping the universe, and that electricity powers stars and other cosmic phenomena. Well, of course, the amount of electricity and power that's going on up there is huge. And we're going to get onto that in a little while, because it even ties in this to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, the reanimation of recently deceased corpses, not humans, the corpses of frogs in a laboratory. But this is all part of the electrified universe. And of course, when our brains are firing, they're firing neurons. This is electricity. What do we call magnetism? It's when someone has a lot of electrical presence. A lot of people can feel that electricity. All this is about is being able to heighten your response to what's going on around you. In other words, awareness, what we've been talking about over the last few years with the ancient civilizations, with their closeness to their reality without being removed from their reality. The idea that the oral culture trained the mind, the idea that people had more what one would call spiritual power, which has been stripped away. Of course, if you want functioning bio robots, give them a phone to play with all day, give them a computer to play with all day. They will start to becoming bio robotized, and they will stop thinking. And that is a big part of what's been going on. So it says in the AI powered internet, the electric universe theory, this pseudo-scientific model suggests that phenomena like planetary craters are caused by mega lightning, that stars are powered by electric currents, and that dark matter and black holes do not exist. Well, I don't think there's any evidence that dark matter and black holes do exist. I read A Brief History of Time by Stephen Hawking, and he didn't prove one thing in the whole book, apart from very simple things which you could believe. Just my opinion. I mean, I think there's probably people out there who are physicists who might disagree. But then again, I knew people who were involved in physics and this quantum world of physics. And there are very differing opinions going on in there. So the scientific community, it says, widely rejects this theory, the electric universe theory, because it contradicts established physics and fails to make testable predictions. Well, we're still really in a Newtonian world as far as the basics go. And Newton was actually far more esoteric than many people realize. And he went along with the idea of the ether. He challenged it, certainly challenged it, but when you look at what was going on in the 1700s, it was pretty cutting edge compared to what's going on now, where things have just got theoretical. Again, the point of observation in the science is limited to belief and scientific doctrine, of course. So now we're going to get on with a bit more from the history of the theories of ether and electricity from the age of Descartes to the close of the 19th century by E.T. Whittaker, 1910. Of course, it's René Descartes who actually kicked this whole thing off, and this idea of the ether was popularized by him. And we can look at the experiments. The main people was Henrik Lorentz, who was born in 1853, and he came up with electron theory in 1892, and he lectured on the invisible force of nature. Lorentz was a passionate and very brilliant scientist, and he was able to carry on even after 1905, when Einstein had put out his general theory of relativity. In fact, it is known that Einstein and Lorentz were in constant contact, because to Lorentz, it was all about the science. It was about nothing else than the truth, trying to find out what was going on. So light and electric carried on the ether. This is the whole concept of it, which actually made so much sense to me. Having had these experiences, which are otherworldly, or they are not, let's call them non-physical experiences. The idea of the ether as the carrier makes complete sense to anybody who's had an out-of-body experience, or anybody who has been able to get into subjects such as remote viewing, clairaudience, clairvoyance, telepathy. All of these things, I think, were quite natural, and they have been taken away. And of course, we've got to look at the resonance that's around us. The earth contains electricity, the telluric energy of the earth. I did some experiments years ago, and I filmed it for a show I did. I think I've still got the show. It was in about 2013, and it was about the telluric energy in the earth and the effect it had on stones, which had a lot of crystal content. And it seemed that if you dragged the stones, you could drag what they call, it's like the Hartman Curry grid, they call this, crisscross of lines of energy in the earth. And this fellow was saying, well, actually, these lines can move, they can be dragged, which he kind of proved. I mean, it wasn't in a laboratory, but what he actually did made perfect sense, because he was using dowsing rods and he was realigning this energy which went through the earth through these crystals. It was a very interesting experiment. And then I carried on looking more into it about the high crystal content of stone, which was used in dolmens and in places where people congregated. And it seems to have some electrical quality that can be used. Of course, it can be used positively or negatively, negatively charged or positively charged. Of course, that's what we're talking about with electricity. Electricity is repelled or attracted. And that's really where this whole idea of ether and the electric current came in. So the fixed ether theory is that ether remains still and the planets move through it. The moving ether theory is that Earth moves with the ether. The ether drag means that ether was dragging the Earth, and the Janus, which would make sense. So these are very childish arguments, in my opinion. Fixed ether, ether remains still, everything moves through it. Moving ether, Earth moves with the ether. Now, this is interesting because it's a bit like that analogy of the flag blowing in the wind. Is the flag moving, or is the wind moving the flag? Or are they both working in unison? They are both working as a result of the actions of the material against this force. And I think that's a really interesting analogy, that one, because it was misrepresented a bit with the New Ages. This, it was consciousness is moving, but the actual original thing is, well, it's your mind that's moving. You're actually not experiencing it. You're making an assumption as to what's happening. And that is very interesting when we look at this idea of the observation. I hope that made sense. It's something that I always thought was really good. The idea that that the flag couldn't move without the wind, and basically the movement of the flag couldn't happen unless they were both interacting, and the flag was reacting to the wind. It's a very simple thing, but it kind of makes you think. I think so anyway. But I like simple stuff, you see. So now we get on to the idea that, what about if everything just moves with the flow and it's all relative to where it is and how much electrical power is being generated? That goes, I think, into the electric universe theory to some extent. We then have a chap called Stephen Gray in the 1700s. He said electrification of a body does not cause any appreciable rise in its temperature. Only the surface of an object takes on electrification. Now, this is interesting because they were saying that in these experiments during the 1700s, that it was the surface of the metal that attracted the electrons and the electrical current. But it didn't, even though there could be the penetration with the electric further into the metal, the conductor, the electric stayed on the surface. And this is a thing that they really were reiterating a lot in these experiments I've been reading today. The heat may penetrate a body, but the electric fluid resides at or near the surface. By 1733, it was stated that around an electrified body there is formed a vortex of very fine matter in a state of agitation, which attracts light that is within the sphere of activity. Well, that explains a lot, doesn't it? That explains a lot about surface electricity. Around an electrified body, there is a vortex of very fine matter in a state of agitation, which attracts light that is within the sphere of activity. Very, very important that when we're looking at these concepts. Observed when an electrically charged object is brought near to the face, for instance. So you get that feeling like there's cobwebs and static, and you can feel static. Some people have static, don't they? They have it all the time. They'll pick something up and it'll have a reaction. And people can actually make lights go on and off. They can make televisions switch on. I mean, this is kind of known. It's not really been explained, of course, only theoretically. By 1746, the Royal Society had stated that electrical actions are due to an electrical ether, which is transferred and cannot be created nor destroyed. Well, that goes along with classical versions of this, doesn't it? Electrical actions are due to an electrical ether which is transferred, cannot be created or destroyed. It's omnipresent. It's always there as a background. That makes complete sense to me. Electric can store and deplete itself through contact with other electrical forces. And Young and Fresnel, look them up if you're interested, Young and Fresnel, they stated the ether behaves as an elastic solid. And that concept is being brought back today. So we now have that from the late 1800s. In the year 2025, we are now back to the idea that the ether behaves as an elastic solid. Now, that doesn't mean it's solid, and it doesn't mean it's like an elastic band. It means that it's movable and it doesn't get pushed in certain directions, but it has flexibility, which makes perfect sense to me. Makes perfect sense. Now we get onto a fella called Luigi Galvani, and from Galvani we get galvanism, galvanized. Now, this is interesting because one of his experiments was the reanimated frog, and it was a complete accident. It came about when using metal conductors, a scalpel, and copper on a dissected frog. The frog actually started contracting and the muscles jerked. So the electricity actually reanimated the frog, or it animated its nervous system. And this is, of course, where we got the concept of Frankenstein, Dr. Frankenstein's monster in Mary Shelley, because, of course, they're waiting for the night with the thunderstorm to pump all of these hundreds of thousands of volts of electricity into this creature to bring it to life. And this is exactly what he did on a very, very much smaller scale with a frog. So they found that the frog's contractions were more violent with some metals than others, and that resin, stone, wood, and gum did not work. So they're not conductors. The limbs of the frog are convulsed when a connection is made between the nerves and muscles by a metallic arc. And this just came out by somebody who had like a scalpel, and they had a copper pipe, a copper ring on it or something. And they put this on the frog, and then he touched it with a scalpel, and then the conduction happened, and they got this reaction from the frog, the dead frog, obviously. The fluid connecting nerves and muscles in the frog made an etheric arc and acted as a conductor. I'm going to read a quote from this experiment now. But I took the animal into a closed room and placed it on an iron plate. And when I pressed the hook, which was fixed in the spinal marrow, against the plate, behold, the same spasmodic contractions as before. The second time we did it. I tried other metals at different hours on various days in several places, and always with the same result, except that the contractions were more violent with some metals than with others, obviously more conductivity. After this, I tried various bodies which are not conductors of electricity, like the ones we've just quoted, but nothing happened. This was somewhat surprising and led me to suspect that electricity is inherent in the animal itself. In other words, it was the electricity that was still present within the frog, which was reacting with the electricity created in the etheric field from outside. This is fantastic stuff, I think. I hope you're finding it as interesting as I am. Um, so he then talks about Leyden jar experiments, which were very popular at the time uh, regarding conductivity. He says, for while I with one hand held the prepared frog by the hook fixed in its spinal marrow so that it stood with its feet on a silver box, and with the other hand touched the lid of the box or its sides with any metallic body, I was surprised to see the frog become strongly convulsed every time that I applied this artifice. So Galvani thus ascertained that the limbs of the frog are convulsed whenever a connection is made between the nerves and muscles by a metallic arc. So there was some very interesting stuff going on in the 17 to 1800s. And from this, we get galvanism and animal electricity. That was Galvani. He would not take the oath, Galvani, to the new republic in France after the revolution, and he became disillusioned, and he died in 1798. But he was a big part of this exploration of light, electricity, and of course the ether. So the current which flows in a given voltaic circuit evidently depends not only on the conductors which form the circuit, but also on the driving power of the battery. Basic electrical stuff here. Anybody who has built a Bedini motor will know what I'm talking about. How do you get perpetual motion? It's quite difficult because the battery degrades. You have to get to a point where there is this continuum, and that is quite hard to achieve with batteries, because even if they are acting in the ways that are known to science, they are still subject to anomalies, which is why I had a friend of mine who was building Bedini motors, and she just couldn't get the thing to be constant, in other words, that it never went off. There would always be something that drained, something that was not being taken account of. And that's what we're really talking about here, this perfection within the etheric and electrical field. And that's something which is still anomalous in a way to science today. So that's known as Davy's law, by the way, taking the driving power into account. And this advance was effected in 1826 by George Simon Ohm. We know where Ohm came from. So this is what Ohm said using Fourier's theory of 1822. You can look that up if you want. Fourier's theory of 1822. I have proceeded from the supposition that the communication of the electricity from one particle takes place directly only to the one next to it, so that no immediate transition from that particle to any other situate at a greater distance occurs. So in other words, it's local. Now, this is interesting because that's the way electricity works with a conductor. But what about this long distance communication that goes on through telepathy? Because we must still be using the same principles of science. If science works in the way that we believe it does, then we are talking about waves being carried. Are we talking about the speed of light here? Because it's certainly got to be faster than the speed of sound. It's got to be the speed of light at least. How do we prove that? That's a very interesting one. And I don't think that has really been focused on. A lot of the stuff that was being done with parapsychology in the 60s focused on these blind experiments of telepathy and clairvoyance. And the problem which was encountered was that of the people sometimes conducting the experiments were actually blocking them from happening. And of course, in mainstream science, that's no excuse. It's like ignorance of the law is no excuse. Ignorance of their law is, of course, no excuse. So, yes, electricity flows to the nearest conductor. Wave theory, linear, then quantum theory came along, where it was down to the observer as a particle or a wave. So, in other words, that's where the quantum world came in. And that's really where a lot of this stuff went into this theoretical science that we see today. And what's happening at CERN, the Hadron Collider? Well, it's a great money laundering exercise, that's for sure. But I got to know somebody who knew one of the scientists who was working there, and he said they don't actually really know what they're doing. Well, I suppose in a way that's not a bad thing, because maybe they're trying to learn. So what followed was more theoretical science, because no one could explain certain things. This is why the black holes and dark matter theories came about. If you don't understand something, always just make up a simple explanation. That's what people have been doing for a very long time. Like the Big Bang, for instance, nothing exploded and everything appeared from nothing. The science trying to explain Genesis in the Bible, that's what that's about. And in the 1700s, about the time all this was happening, there was a group of Whig lawyers that said if they could disprove the lineage of kings, then the Bible itself could be disproven and the monarchy could be abolished. So we had some very interesting stuff. And of course, we've got to remember this is the time of the French Revolution, very turbulent times in a way. But as far as science went, real groundbreaking. I would recommend anyone reads that book on the ether. I'll give you the title of it at the end of the show again. So, yes, I've talked about the Arrhenius experiment with CO2. The CO2 is created or appears after the warming. It's not a driver of temperature, it follows temperature. So basically we're being completely lied to there. And then we get into quantum physics, of course, because this has taken up most of our time in our lifetimes. Quantum mechanics describes phenomena in probabilistic terms, probabilities, eliminating the necessity for a physical medium. This shift from ether to quantum theories marks a paradigm change in understanding fundamental physics, progressing from a classical deterministic view to a probabilistic model. Well, to me, that's just not good enough. And from this, we get, of course, the science we're not allowed to question, the science which is consensus, the end of science. So people like Lorentz would be absolutely appalled about this computer modeling and this idea of probabilities. Probabilities are okay if you've got something to back them up. The days of the discovery of ether and experiment with light and electricity, of course, were groundbreaking. The reanimation of Frankenstein's monster through electric current was based on these experiments we've been talking about today. The reanimation of the nervous system of the dead frog through electric current absorbed through the ether by the conductors. So ether does tie into the unified field theory. So we'll just get onto that now. The unified field theory is modern physics goal to describe all fundamental forces as a single framework. In other words, a theory of everything, which is what they talk about now. But I think the unified field is much more profound than that and ties in directly with the idea of ether. While ether is an older, mostly discarded concept, it says here on the internet, of a medium through which waves like light travel. Well, electricity. And well, the ether is a carrier. I think if we just get our heads around that concept, it makes a lot more sense. Some modern theories propose a unified field as the underlying ether. Well, that's exactly what I thought before I'd looked at all this stuff on the internet. That's what I've always thought. That's what I wanted to look into it for, because the unified field, the term unified field, just makes sense. That everything has to be interconnected at some level, and it depends on what level that interconnection happens. It's like electricity. It's either repelled or attracted. That happens all through life. You are repelled by some things, attracted to others, and they may not be good or bad things. There's just a reason for that. We are electrical beings. We are made up of the same stuff as is out there. And that to me is the fascinating thing about it all, really. So yes, it says mainstream physics views ether as disproven. By whom? Nobody. It's never been disproven. It's just the word consensus that we're getting, which means that everyone's herded into one particular view, because that's the way the society and the social engineering at the time needs to work, a bit like social Darwinism, a bit like Darwinism itself, versus, creationism. And then, of course, we've got the other anomalies which come out of that, which is not creationism, but the idea that there is something in between creationism and Darwinism, and that is allowed to happen within the discourse. Stuff we've covered a lot over the past couple of years, actually, on and off, when we're talking about more esoteric things. So, okay, unified field theory, what it is. A theoretical framework in physics that seeks to unify all fundamental forces like gravity and electromagnetism and elementary particles into a single coherent model. Well, I think that's what they were trying to do in the 1700s anyway. That was the original description of the ether at that particular time. Now, Einstein worked on a unified field theory, but he was unsuccessful in his attempts to describe particles like the electron and proton as part of this framework. Well, isn't that really quite contradictory as to what this whole movement was about, which came into the field after about 1905, 1910, up to like 1920? So the modern approach, it says here, contemporary efforts continue to seek a unified theory, often through more advanced concepts like string theory or quantum loop gravity, which are far more complex than what Einstein was able to develop. So, yes, I've already gone on to string theory. So they say that the ether is an obsolete scientific concept that posited a medium filling all of space, which was thought to be necessary for the propagation of light and other electromagnetic waves. Well, how can that be obsolete? The idea of ether was important in the development of electromagnetism, as it was believed to be the medium for waves, much like air is for sound. Still makes sense to me. So yes, then it goes into the Michelson-Morley experiment. Now, this is very similar to what's happened with the movement which has promoted climate change and global warming. So really, it's about social engineering and what is good, what is for the common good of the people to know about. So yeah, modern synthesis, unified field as a modern ether. This is what I've been thinking about for such a long time, and that's why I'm bringing it in at this point. New interpretations. Some contemporary papers propose that a unified field could be a modern version of the ether. So there are papers on this, peer-reviewed papers. Shared characteristics. These theories suggest the unified field is the fundamental substrata or tension field from which everything emerges, similar to the old ether concept. So nothing's changed. So we're still back to this idea of the ether as the carrier, which was the theory from at least 2,000 to 3,000 years ago, at least 2,000 and getting on for 3,000 years ago. So nothing's changed in this concept. Absolutely nothing at all. Mainstream view. While these ideas are being explored, the dominant view in physics is that ether as originally conceived is not real, but it's not been disproved. So this is quite revealing and interesting. So what does ether do? It carries information. Electricity itself is an information carrier carried on the ether. Light is an information carrier from one pole to a magnetized pole of the same flow direction, and the opposite pole repels. This is really what these people were talking about in the last few hundred years. What makes us conscious? Is it the electrical impulses in our brains? That's a big question. That's how we tie into the etheric field. What makes us conscious? It's never actually been fully and properly explained. And in this materialistic worldview, which has now dumbed everything down, we get the useful idiots being rolled out to attempt to debunk what is common sense. Doesn't matter whether it's Dawkins or Susan Blackmore. It doesn't really matter. These people are missing the point, and that is why they're promoted. So yes, is it the electrical impulse in our brains? We're firing neurons. Is it possible that consciousness survives the death of the body? I personally believe it does, but I'm not going to get into any arguments about it, because people who believe one thing and are dogmatic about it rarely change their minds. And I remember having a conversation one night, and I was talking about concepts which were quite easy to grasp. And this fellow who worked as a film editor, he said, well, 2 and 2 is 4 though, isn't it? And he kept bringing it, which had nothing to do with what I was talking about. So he had to bring something down to this analogy that on this basic level, if you can add two lots of 2 together, it makes 4. Therefore, that is in concrete and cannot be changed. Therefore, anything that may sound abstract cannot be real. And we still see that in relation to what we're talking about here. And then we get on to the God gene. What was given to us? Creation. Well, whether you're a creationist or a Darwinist or something in between, we're allowed to have something in between. I forgot what it's called now. I've actually covered it. It's the idea of intelligent design, which actually attracts people who don't believe in God, but they believe in nature and the way that things operate. But if you're coming from a completely materialistic viewpoint here, then you will never get any of this stuff. And to me, that is the real functioning biorobot that is necessary to do menial tasks. The sort of functioning biorobot that is the byproduct of communism, or indeed the communitarian system, where everybody is actually under a form of strict governance and too scared or too indoctrinated to say anything outside it. And again, this all comes down to electricity. And the dumbing down of the population has definitely removed electrical impulse in the brain, particularly, but in interactions also. Have you noticed that? Where's the charisma these days? Not many people have what we used to call charisma. All this is electrical energy. Interesting. Telepathy, clairvoyance, clairaudience, out-of-body experiences, remote viewing. The ground is electrified, of course. The telluric current, the brain and body are electrified. Neurons fire with electricity. The spirit is electrified. Ether, the essence after death, does it pass on? Ghosts are electrified etheric current stuck in space-time. That works with both theories. When you think about it, it works with the theory of relativity and it works with the theory of ether. There is no real difference when you get to this level of what belief system you use, unless, of course, you're just a materialistic. And that is, of course, what they want people to be, because it's easier to control people who believe that, people who have a higher belief and are able to entrain and get onto higher levels of thinking, neurons, more electricity, and achievement, again, more production. That is not what is wanted. What is wanted is the average and the less than average, because that's easy to manage. But that's not where civilization actually improves and goes anywhere. So what we've been talking about here is the advancement of civilization in the 17 to 1800s. And now this sort of nosedive into theory and basically the world of the anorak and the train spotter. Nothing is based on direct evidence or direct experience. And people are getting more and more like that. So in other words, they're going away from the natural order of the way things actually are, the natural order which was being studied by these scientists we've been talking about tonight. So yes, a history of the theories of ether in 1910, which is when it was published. It's called A History of the Theories of Ether by E.T. Whitaker, published 1910. This is how it closes. Let this record close with the anticipation that fellowship in the pursuit of knowledge will increase in the nations the spirit of generous emulation and mutual respect. Well, that really should have been the way things turned out. But what do we have? We have everything outside the paradigm described as a conspiracy theory or even hate speak. That would never have happened when this book was being written. People would have argued, but those arguments were on the level of intellect, science, and advancement. Today, they're about the shutting down of dissent for the benefit of parasites. So things have changed a lot since this book was written. So I saw a quote from a scientist earlier on today, which stated, "We use Lorentz's formulas for literally everything, even in modern general relativity. Even Einstein agreed with the theory of an ether, but said it was not detectable within our system. The universe without it would be unthinkable," stated Einstein. Now we have consensus, of course, based on computer modeling and not even real observation. This is the wrong turn, which leads to fraud and corruption, as in the false theories of the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, to name but one. I always bring them up because the nonsense and the lies and fraud which come out of that organization affect everybody on the planet. So that's just a good example. Hope you enjoyed that. It's something I've been wanting to do for a while, but I needed to put it into the right framework. It's definitely a departure from ancient history, but in a way, it's all history. And if we don't learn from history, then we've got no future. Somebody actually put under one of the videos, which was put out recently, where I was a guest on someone's show. They said, "Oh, this guy, he's talking about stuff from 10 to 15 years ago, probably just talks about that with his mates in the pub." Didn't realize that I was giving historical context to move things forward. So in other words, to understand the system that we're in, we have to know at least the recent history. And indeed, we learn more the further we go back in history. And that is the key. Knowledge is the key, and the electrification of our minds is all we have. So, hope you enjoyed that. I'll be back with more of these, and do check out the live streams which we're going to put up over the next few weeks. I will be doing a lot more. I've had a lot of things to attend to, and these shows take a lot of time to put together, which is why I have been spreading them out a little bit. But I hope they're worth it, and do stay in touch through the website. I'm going to have a look at some of the comments here, and thanks for joining us.